Hello. So, I want to talk about arm wrestling, and specifically I feel like arm wrestling as it is right now is in a very particular primordial position. It is not a new sport, as you all know, but it is a sport which does not have much science or training methodology put into it yet. There is no broad sense of how to train for arm wrestling. In other sports, the science is much more developed and methodological because they have had more time working on it in a professional sense. But in arm wrestling, for the majority of its life, it has been, as you know, an underground sport with mainly people messing around and trying to see what works for them. But now recently it has become a more dominant and prominent field of athletic performance. Arm wrestling is difficult because it is not quite so black and white as something like powerlifting, where the main requirement is for the athlete to lift a weight from point A to point B. But with arm wrestling, there is much more variable resistance applied. For clarity, I'm going to break the potential athlete into two possible groups. There is the part-timer, who will make up the majority of people watching this. For these people, arm wrestling will be a part-time sport or hobby, or perhaps they simply enjoy the movement and the aesthetics of this training style. Then there are the full-time athletes. For these people it is hardly worth explaining these things, as they will have sought out coaches and professionals who know exactly these things. For the full-time athletes, you will, as with all other full-time sports, see a far higher percentage of perfect athletes who are genetically predisposed to being good at the sport. This would be mainly due to them being pulled into that sport at an early age, and continuing because they were good at it. It is an unfair advantage, but a very natural system to filter out the best from the worst. This is why the common sentiment of the better athlete is the one who has spent longer training is correct, most of the time, but not simply through the time spent training. There are many athletes who are trained equally long or longer than the athletes better than them, yet still remain less victorious. And there are some, but very few athletes who start very late into a sport and achieve success. The majority of the best athletes are those who are genetically superior and have the most time spent building their strength and skills. On top of this are drugs. These can equalize things to some degree, but the moment that everybody is drugged equally, the spread of results will be identical to the undrugged results, just shifted. Of course, again, variation exists here too. There will be some who respond to drugs better, some who take more drugs or better drugs or enhance themselves above the lesser responders or lower doses. But in that system, superior bodies will emerge as they always do. The ones who respond best to drugs, who take the most beneficial dosage, who have trained for longer and who are genetically more suited overall for their sport, which is both a physical and mental factor. As with most things, it is a combination of threads which all intertwine together to produce the best outcome, rather than a single clean thread pulling the others. But arm wrestling also offers an advantage over most other sports, perhaps because it is not a formally structured Olympic sport with massive pushes for the best athletes from the entire world. Although you can see this beginning to take shape, the competitive age for arm wrestling seems to be much broader than that of others. In most Olympic sports, the age at which an athlete is at their prime ranges from late teens to early 20s. Approaching or passing 30 years old is almost never done. The age bracket is lower for sports which require more bodyweight skills, flexibility and mobility, like gymnastics, and the sports which favour more brute force and strength tend to favour more mature athletes, such as throwing and weightlifting. Skill acquisition is best done when young, as the brain is malleable and growing, but pure strength requires a mature frame to work from and takes time to progress. Arm wrestling is then a difficult sport to plot out cleanly as either a strength or speed majority sport. It contains aspects of both. When the opponent is resisting, the athlete requires pure strength and force production. At all other times, if for example the opponent was weaker or slower, it would be incredibly beneficial for the athlete to be able to move quickly. In sports science, we have the force velocity curve, which is used to visualize the exchange in movements tending towards strength or speed. At the peak of force production, the load is maximal, but the velocity at which it moves from point A to point B is zero. These can be seen as isometrics, where the load is higher than the athlete's capacity to move, but they are able to exert maximal effort against it. At the other end, at the peak velocity production, the load is minimal, but the velocity is quite high. It's very high. This can be seen as unweighted exercises, not counting body weight or weight of the limbs being used, moving very quickly from point A to point B. This is most often represented by sprinting. In between these then, with medium load and medium velocity, is what we consider power movements. That is, exercises which have enough load and enough speed to stimulate training responses to each, although not maximally in either. These are things like power cleans, power snatches, weighted sled sprints, etc. As weight increases with these, the velocity decreases unless force output is able to increase equally with it, which it is not because people are limited. So in a heavy power clean, the barbell velocity will be lower than a lighter one, although the velocity of the athlete under the bar might increase, since they have a heavier mass to move the body weight against. Above and below this midpoint are further exercises. The heavy exercises with high force and low velocity will be usually represented as working weight squats, bench press or deadlift, etc. The benefits of barbell movements is that the load can be adjusted, minimally if needed, to shift the stimulus along this scale either up or down. Light exercises then could be simply lighter versions of the above, or variations of exercises like medicine ball throws or bodyweight movements with additional weight. As a general rule then, arm wrestling sits for the bulk of its training in between these two extremes, tending above the midpoint. You might ask then why so little speed training for arm wrestling? Some athletes are very fast. Well, the answer there is that they're not fast against minimal resistance. There is no point in an arm wrestling match, which is the actual sport, where the opponent exerts zero force. With very strong athletes versus very weak athletes, the difference will obviously be huge, but still not zero resistance. And furthermore, it would be very rare for a strong athlete to be seriously fighting a very weak one. Of course, in terms of learning the specific movements of arm wrestling, load is a negative until patterns are formed sufficiently. But even then, pulling against nothing is not comparable to pulling against a person. So resistance should be added as soon as possible to encourage specific skill acquisition, which is best stimulated through table practice. So theoretically, as John Brzenk and Krasimir Kostadinov have preached, table practice can or perhaps should make up the vast majority of an athlete's training time. This works well because through opponent selection or requests for specific opponent actions, an athlete can work across all ranges of the force-velocity curve without needing to leave the sport-specific stimulus of a table. So this is a perfect way to train for everybody wanting anything related to arm wrestling, right? No. Unfortunately, reality is not quite so perfect as theory. Not everybody has access full-time to a table with an unlimited supply of perfectly specific opponents. They might enjoy doing other training outside of arm wrestling, and it is also much harder to gauge progress through table training compared to static resistance type exercises. You might start winning more on the table because you got stronger, or learn new techniques. But you might also win more because your opponent is injured or weaker. The time of day might favour you, the climate is beneficial to your particular needs, or the table is slightly angled to your benefit because the floor is not quite flat. There are all these variables that factor into why you might be improving on paper. But again, reality is not quite so clean and clear cut as this theoretical, clean training environment. So then in a more dirty, less linear world, training with other movements might work well and offer benefits for the individual that simple training cannot, like hypertrophy, convenience and less pain. I will go over more specific exercises in future videos, but to outline the training according to the force-velocity curve we have. The majority of training, off-table, should be heavy exercises with higher load and lower speed, and power movements with medium load and speed. These are going to be, for the vast majority, non-specific, general strength-type movements. This means that they will not mimic the sport specifically. Once you start adding loads and angles to movements intended to imitate table movements in extreme excess of reality, you begin to train those movements slowly and often in patterns not at all usable on the table. If you are able to load the more specific movements responsibly and in ways which closely resemble the movements you aim to strengthen, then specific overloading can be beneficial. But for the vast majority of people, especially the beginners, movements unlike the table ones will be more broadly beneficial to the body. And then this general strength can be specifically directly channeled into the specific movements required on the table by practicing them on the table. Sprinters use squats to strengthen the legs, and they sprint to utilize that strength in specific ways. Recent movements in sports training has moved entirely away from weighted sprinting, which was popular before, as this did nothing but make the sprinters run slower, even if they did so more strongly. You can think of it as building the body roughly and then shaping it specifically. So to recap, broadly speaking, the majority of strength training for arm wrestlers, especially non-professional athletes, should take the form of broad, non-specific, medium to heavy exercises. As arm wrestling is an upper body dominant sport, exercises like squats and deadlifts can have minimal benefits. but they will still benefit total body fitness over only training arms. Having a stronger lower back, core and legs will do nothing but benefit an athlete, providing a much more stable base to push the upper body from. Obviously, squatting will not have much benefit for arm wrestling, so the majority of training should be more above the belt. Exercises like bench press, rows and their variations will be a very good foundation for very general strength. And then the fun stuff, which is probably why you're here. All of the curls and cable pulls take place, but the important thing to remember is to use sensible weights. We all see Larry Wheels and Levan maxing out, but we don't see much of their regular day-to-day training. Using the roughly generated force velocity distribution of 15, 30 and 30%, we can say that for every lift that approaches maximal weight and lowest speed, there should be at least 4 other sessions of that lift that either move much faster or slightly faster. This is perhaps not as much fun as maxing out daily, but if the goal intended is useful progress or even just hypertrophy and general development, the key is recoverable sessions done regularly for long periods of time, which is the key to essentially any type of strength or progression in any sport. Of course, we did not touch upon drugs, but maybe we'll go over that later. They do alter this dramatically and permit much more training than the average clean athlete could not recover from to be done regularly. Well, that's about it. A broad, rough overview of training distribution for arm wrestling. Focus more on the amateur, beginner or part-time athlete. Let me know if you want to hear anything specific and I'll definitely get to it next time.